The desert wind carried grit across the firing range at Fort Kearny, and Corporal Vivian Reese felt every particle of it against her face as she stepped out of the transport vehicle. The Nevada sun hammered down on the sprawling military complex, turning the air into something thick and shimmering. She adjusted the strap of her tactical bag and surveyed the range before her, taking in the scattered figures of soldiers clustered around various firing positions, their voices carrying across the distance in bursts of laughter and competitive banter. She had kept quiet during the entire ride from base housing, listening to the other soldiers discuss their previous range scores, their preferred weapons, their theories about wind compensation at extreme distances. None of them had asked her opinion. None of them had asked her anything at all. Sergeant Damon Pritchett stood near the equipment lockers, his broad frame casting a shadow across the concrete pad. He was holding a clipboard and barking instructions to a group of privates who scrambled to organize ammunition crates. When he noticed Vivian approaching, his expression shifted into something between amusement and dismissal. "Need you to sign in over here," he said, not bothering to look up from his clipboard. "You here for the basic qualifications, or just observing?" Vivian kept her voice steady. "Qualifications, Sergeant." He glanced at her then, really looked at her for the first time, and she saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. She was used to it by now, that particular assessment that men in uniform seemed compelled to perform. At 5'6" with a runner's build, she knew she did not fit whatever mental image they carried of a serious marksman. "Right," Pritchett said slowly. "Well, we'll get you set up on the 200-yard line. Standard M4 qualification. Should be straightforward enough. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have military bases near you. Or perhaps you have witnessed moments where someone proved everyone wrong about what they were capable of achieving." Vivian nodded without comment and moved toward the equipment area. Behind her, she heard Pritchett mutter something to the soldier beside him, followed by a low chuckle. The words did not carry clearly, but the tone did. She had heard that tone in a dozen different contexts, on a dozen different bases, in a dozen different situations where men assumed her presence was either decorative or accidental. The firing line stretched out before her in organized chaos. To her left, a group of Marines were zeroing their rifles, the sharp crack of gunfire punctuating their shouted corrections to each other. To her right, a pair of Army Rangers were breaking down a Barrett M82, the massive 50 caliber rifle spread across a maintenance mat in carefully organized pieces. Beyond them all, the range extended into the distance, target posts marking intervals that grew progressively smaller as they receded toward the base of the distant mountains. Staff Sergeant Kyle Braxton emerged from the range operations building, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses that reflected the brutal afternoon light. He carried himself with the particular swagger of someone who had never been told he was anything less than exceptional. When he spotted Vivian standing near the equipment lockers, his pace slowed and his expression shifted into something that might have been a smile on a less angular face. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying across the space between them. "Did somebody order a recruitment poster? Because I think there has been some kind of mix-up with the delivery." The soldiers within earshot turned to look, and Vivian felt the weight of their attention settle across her shoulders like a physical thing. She kept her expression neutral, her hands relaxed at her sides, her breathing steady despite the spike of irritation that tried to surface. "Just here for qualifications, Staff Sergeant," she said evenly. Braxton moved closer, circling around her with exaggerated interest. "Qualifications," he repeated, drawing the word out. "You ever actually fired a weapon before? Or we started from scratch here? Because I've got to tell you, this is not exactly a beginner-friendly environment. These boys here," he gestured to the soldiers around them, "they've been doing this since they could walk. This is serious business." Vivian met his gaze without flinching. "I can handle it." The challenge hung in the air between them, and she watched something shift in Braxton's demeanor. His smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Around them, other soldiers had stopped what they were doing, drawn by the prospect of entertainment. Braxton crossed his arms over his chest, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having been proven wrong. "So here is what we are going to do," he announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "We're going to start you off real gentle-like. Maybe some stationary targets at 100 yards. See if you can hit the broadside of a barn before we waste ammunition on anything more complicated." Vivian felt the familiar weight of assumption pressing down on her, the same weight she had carried through every posting, every assignment, every moment when someone decided they knew her capabilities before she had fired a single round. She thought about her father, about the countless hours spent on ranges not so different from this one, about the calluses on her trigger finger that told a story these men would never bother to read. "That works," she said simply. The disappointment in Braxton's expression was almost comical. He had wanted resistance, wanted an excuse to escalate, wanted something he could use to further prove whatever point he was trying to make. Instead, he got compliance, and it seemed to deflate him slightly. Pritchett returned with a standard issue M4 rifle and handed it to Vivian with the kind of exaggerated care someone might use when giving a loaded weapon to a child. "You know how to do a safety check, right?" he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer would be no. Vivian took the rifle, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She dropped the magazine, checked the chamber, inspected the bore, verified the safety mechanism, and conducted a function check in less than 15 seconds. When she looked up, Pritchett's expression had shifted from condescension to mild surprise. "Okay then," he muttered. "Range is hot. You are clear to move to the firing line." She walked to the designated position, aware of the eyes tracking her movement. The other soldiers had abandoned any pretense of continuing their own activities. This was entertainment now, a break in the monotony of routine qualifications, a chance to watch someone fail in a way that would give them stories to tell later. The 100-yard targets stood in neat rows, standard silhouettes against the pale desert backdrop. Vivian settled into position, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle, the texture of the grip, the slight resistance of the trigger as she took up the slack. The wind was moving left to right at approximately 8 miles per hour, gusting occasionally to 12. The mirage rising from the heated ground created distortion patterns that required compensation. She calculated the adjustments automatically, muscle memory combining with practiced observation. 5 rounds, Braxton called out from behind her. "Center mass. Take your time, sweetheart. No ruse." The condescension in his voice was so thick it was almost tangible, but Vivian pushed it away, focusing instead on her breathing, on the rhythm that her father had taught her decades ago in the woods behind their Virginia home. Breathe in, breathe out, find the natural pause between respirations where the body settles into stillness. She fired 5 times in quick succession, the reports echoing across the range in a tight cluster of sound. The rifle's recoil was familiar, comfortable, like shaking hands with an old friend. When she lowered the weapon and waited for the target assessment, she could feel the tension behind her, the anticipation of mockery tempered slightly by uncertainty. Pritchett raised his binoculars and studied the target for a long moment. His silence stretched out, and Vivian heard someone behind her whisper a question that went unanswered. Finally, Pritchett lowered the binoculars and turned to look at her with an expression that suggested he was recalculating something fundamental. "All 5 in the 10 ring," he said flatly. "Grouping is about 2 inches. The murmur that rippled through the gathered soldiers was audible, a mixture of surprise and grudging acknowledgement. Braxton moved forward, his swagger slightly diminished, and took the binoculars from Pritchett to verify the assessment himself. Vivian watched him study the target, watched the muscles in his jaw tighten, watched him search for some explanation that would preserve his assumptions. "Lucky shots," Braxton declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "Wind died down right when you fired. Let's see you do it again at 200 yards with a crosswind." Vivian simply nodded and moved to the next firing position. She did not need to argue or defend. The targets would speak for her, just as they always had. Around her, the dynamics were shifting in ways both subtle and obvious. The outright mockery had diminished, replaced by something more guarded, more watchful. They were still skeptical, still convinced that what they had witnessed was anomaly rather than ability, but now there was at least a question mark where before there had been only certainty. The 200-yard line offered a more challenging scenario. The targets were smaller, the wind more pronounced, the margin for error substantially reduced. Vivian chambered a fresh magazine and settled into her stance, feeling the ground beneath her boots, feeling the way the wind pushed against her left side, feeling the weight of scrutiny that was different now than it had been 10 minutes ago. She took her time with the 200-yard setup, making minute adjustments to her position that most of the watching soldiers would not recognize as significant. The angle of her hips relative to the target, the placement of her support elbow, the way she tucked the stock into the pocket of her shoulder with just enough pressure to manage recoil without fighting it. These are the details that separated competent shooters from exceptional ones, the small choices that accumulated into consistent accuracy. Private First Class Tommy Nguyen had wandered over from the adjacent firing line, his curiosity apparently stronger than his commitment to his own qualification round. He stood just behind Braxton, his youthful face showing open interest rather than the hostile skepticism of his superiors. "Man, that grouping at 100 was tight," he said to no one in particular. "Like really tight." Braxton shot him a look that could have strip paint. "It was luck," he repeated, his voice harder now. "Wind conditions. Happens sometimes. Watch what happens when she has to compensate for real environmental factors." Vivian ignored the commentary and focused on her breathing pattern. In through the nose, out through the mouth, finding that space between heartbeats where everything settled into clarity. The wind was gusting now, inconsistent, pushing at her from angles that shifted every few seconds. She waited, patient, reading the mirage patterns and the way the heat shimmer moved across her sight picture. Her father had taught her to see wind not as an obstacle, but as information, a language written in the movement of air and dust and distant heat waves. When the gust pattern stabilized into something predictable, she squeezed the trigger 5 times with mechanical precision. The rifle barked its familiar rhythm, and she rode the recoil with practiced ease, reacquiring her sight picture between each shot without conscious thought. It was muscle memory now, refined over thousands of repetitions until the weapon felt less like a tool and more like an extension of her own nervous system. Pritchett already had his binoculars up before she finished the string. The silence that followed stretched out longer this time, and Vivian could feel the tension building behind her like static electricity before a storm. She safed the weapon and waited, her expression neutral, while Pritchett studied the target with what appeared to be genuine concentration. For in the 10 ring, he finally said, his voice carefully controlled, "1 in the 9 ring at 11 o'clock. Grouping is maybe 3 inches accounting for the flyer." "That is not possible," Braxton said flatly. He strode forward and yanked the binoculars from Pritchett's hands, pressing them to his eyes with enough force that it must have been uncomfortable. Vivian watched him scan the target once, twice, 3 times, searching for evidence of some mistake or misreading. His jaw worked silently, muscles clenching and releasing as he processed what he was seeing. Lieutenant Cordelia Vance had emerged from the range operations building and was walking toward the gathered group with the purposeful stride of someone who had been monitoring the situation and decided it required her attention. She was in her mid-30s, her uniform crisp despite the heat, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that somehow made her look more rather than less formidable. When she reached the firing line, she held out her hand for the binoculars without asking, and Braxton surrendered them with visible reluctance. Vance studied the target in silence for perhaps 30 seconds before lowering the binoculars and turning her attention to Vivian. "What did you call before this, Corporal?" she asked, her tone professionally neutral, but carrying an undercurrent of genuine interest. "Fort Benning, Vivian replied. "And Camp Lejeune before that." Vance nodded slowly, processing this information. "What is your MOS?" "Logistique Spécialiste, Mong." The answer seemed to surprise Vance, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "Logistics," she repeated. "Not infantry, not designated marksman. Logistics." "Yes, ma'am." Vance handed the binoculars back to Pritchett and studied Vivian with open curiosity now, the professional assessment of someone trying to reconcile observable data with expected patterns. Behind her, more soldiers had drifted over from other parts of the range, drawn by words spreading through the informal networks that existed in any military installation. Something interesting was happening, and no one wanted to miss it. Staff Sergeant Braxton cleared his throat, and Vivian could hear the defensiveness already forming in his tone before he spoke. "Ma'am, I think what we are seeing here is decent fundamentals combined with favorable conditions. At these distances, with minimal wind, even a moderately trained shooter can produce acceptable groupings. What really separates skilled marksmen from weekend hobbyists is performance under challenging conditions at extended ranges." Vance turned to look at him, one eyebrow raised fractionally. "Extended ranges," she said. "What did you have in mind, Staff Sergeant?" Braxton's expression shifted into something that might have been satisfaction. "The Barrett is set up on the 1,000-yard line," he said. "We have been running some long-range familiarization drills this week. Maybe Corporal Reese would like to try her hand at something more demanding. See how those decent fundamentals hold up when the physics actually matter." The suggestion hung in the desert air like a challenge that could not be withdrawn. Vivian felt the shift in attention, the way every soldier within earshot suddenly focused on this moment with the intensity of spectators at a gladiatorial arena. The Barrett M82A1 was not a weapon for casual shooters. It was a 50 caliber anti-material rifle weighing nearly 30 pounds, capable of engaging targets at distances that turned shooting into an exercise in advanced mathematics and environmental reading. At 1,000 yards, every variable mattered. Wind speed and direction at multiple points along the bullet's trajectory. Temperature affecting powder burn rate and air density. The Coriolis effect from the Earth's rotation. Mirage distortion. Even the shooter's heartbeat could throw off a shot at that distance. Lieutenant Vance studied Braxton with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what game he was playing. "That is quite a jump from 200 yards to 1,000, Staff Sergeant," she said carefully. "The Barrett is not a beginner's weapon." Braxton's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Which is exactly my point, ma'am. If Corporal Reese here wants to prove she belongs on a range with serious shooters, this is how you do it. Otherwise, we're just wasting time and ammunition on party tricks." Vivian kept her expression neutral, but internally she was calculating. The Barrett was familiar territory. She had qualified on the M107 variant at Fort Benning, and her father had owned a civilian M82 that she had fired hundreds of times growing up. The weapon's reputation for difficulty was somewhat overstated among people who understood its characteristics. Yes, it had substantial recoil. Yes, it required different techniques than a standard rifle. But the fundamentals remained the same, and the 50 caliber round was actually more forgiving of minor errors at extreme distance than smaller calibers because of its superior ballistic coefficient and resistance to wind drift. "I am willing to try," Vivian said quietly, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the gathered soldiers. The crowd's reaction was immediate and mixed. Some soldiers laughed outright, the sound harsh and dismissive. Others exchanged glances that communicated skepticism without words. A few, including Private Nguyen, looked genuinely interested in seeing what would happen. Braxton's expression shifted into something approaching triumph, as if Vivian had just walked into a trap he had been carefully constructing. "Outstanding," he said, drawing the word out. "Pritchett, let's get the Barrett set up for Corporal Reese. Make sure it is properly zeroed. Would not want equipment issues to interfere with this demonstration." Lieutenant Vance moved closer to Vivian, her voice dropping low enough that only Vivian could hear. "You do not have to do this, Corporal. Staff Sergeant Braxton is playing games, and you do not need to participate. Your qualification scores at standard distances are already excellent." Vivian met her gaze steadily. "I appreciate that, ma'am, but I would like to try." Vance studied her for a long moment, and Vivian could see the calculation happening behind the lieutenant's eyes. Finally, Vance nodded slowly. "All right, but we do this properly. Full safety protocols. Spotter assistance if you want it. Norusing. The walk to the 1,000-yard line felt longer than the actual distance involved. Vivian was aware of the procession forming behind her. At least 20 soldiers abandoning their own activities to witness what they clearly expected to be a spectacular failure. She heard fragments of conversation, predictions about how badly this would go, speculation about whether she would even be able to handle the weapon's recoil, jokes about needing a medic on standby for a separated shoulder. The Barrett M82A1 rested on a shooting bench at the far end of the range, its massive barrel extending nearly 4 feet from the receiver. The weapon was finished in military gray, covered in the small scratches and wear marks that spoke of extensive use. A high-magnification scope was mounted on the rail, and beside the rifle sat several magazines loaded with 50 caliber BMG ammunition, each round nearly 6 inches long and thick as a man's thumb. Pritchett gestured to the rifle with exaggerated courtesy. "All yours, Corporal. Weapon is zeroed for 1,000 yards. Windage is currently set neutral. You want to check your dope and make adjustments based on current conditions." Vivian approached the bench and studied the rifle without touching it yet. The wind had picked up slightly, steady from the west at approximately 12 miles per hour with gusts to 15. The temperature was 104 degrees according to the range thermometer. Humidity was minimal, typical for Nevada desert. She could see the target downrange, a standard silhouette that looked impossibly small at this distance, wavering in the heat mirage like something from a fever dream. She picked up the rifle, feeling its weight settle into her hands. It was heavy, yes, but balanced in a way that made sense once you understood its design philosophy. The bipod legs were already deployed and adjusted. She settled behind the weapon, checking the position of the buttstock against her shoulder, verifying her head position relative to the scope, ensuring her trigger finger placement was correct. Behind her, Braxton was addressing the gathered soldiers with the confidence of someone narrating an outcome he considered inevitable. "Now, pay attention here," he was saying, his voice carrying the pedagogical tone of an instructor delivering a lesson. "What you are about to witness is why we do not just hand precision weapons to people who happen to shoot decent groups at basic distances. The Barrett requires strength, technique, and experience. Without all three, you're just making noise and wasting taxpayers' money on ammunition." Vivian tuned out the commentary and focused on her pre-shot routine. She had learned long ago that the mental preparation was as important as the physical mechanics. Her father used to say that long-range shooting was 90% meditation and 10% trigger press, and while the percentages were debatable, the principle was sound. She needed to empty her mind of everything except the variables that mattered. Through the scope, the target materialized with crystalline clarity despite the distance. The magnification was set to 20 power, and she could see the details of the silhouette, the way heat waves distorted its edges, the slight movement of the target frame in the wind. She adjusted the parallax focus until the reticle sat on the same focal plane as the target, eliminating any potential for optical error. The wind was her primary concern. At 1,000 yards, a 12-mile-per-hour crosswind would push a 50 caliber round approximately 30 inches off course without compensation. She studied the mirage patterns, watching the heat shimmer move across her sight picture like water flowing over glass. The mirage angle told her wind direction at the target. The speed of its movement told her wind velocity. Between her position and the target, she could see several other indicators: dust patterns on the range floor, the movement of sparse vegetation, the way flags hung at various distances along the course. "You need a spotter?" Pritchett asked from beside her, his tone suggesting he expected the answer to be yes. "No, thank you, Sergeant," Vivian replied without taking her eye from the scope. She heard someone behind her, possibly one of the Rangers, mutter something about pride coming before a fall. The comment rolled off her like water off treated canvas. She had stopped caring about other people's expectations years ago, somewhere between her third duty station and her fourth supervisor, who assumed incompetence until proven otherwise. The only expectations that mattered were the ones she set for herself, and those were measured in fractions of an inch on distant targets. Her breathing settled into the familiar rhythm. 4 seconds in, hold for 2, 6 seconds out, natural pause. The rifle rose and fell minutely with each breath, and she timed her trigger press for the pause between exhalations when her body reached its most stable state. The Barrett's trigger had a clean break at approximately 4 pounds of pressure, crisp and predictable once you understood its characteristics. She made her windage adjustment, dialing the scope turret 3 clicks right to compensate for the crosswind. The click of each adjustment was audible in the relative silence that had fallen over the range. Even Braxton had stopped talking, though whether from respect for range protocol or anticipation of her failure was unclear. Vivian placed her finger on the trigger, taking up the slack until she felt the point of resistance that preceded the break. This was the moment that separated theoretical knowledge from practical ability. Everything prior to this instant was preparation and calculation. Everything after would be result and consequence. But this specific moment, this fraction of a second before the trigger broke and the firing pin struck the primer, this was where the shooter existed alone with physics and probability. The rifle thundered, and the concussive blast rolled across the range like a physical force. The recoil drove back into her shoulder with significant energy, but she had positioned herself correctly and rode it without disruption. The muzzle brake redirected much of the blast sideways, creating a dust cloud that momentarily obscured her view. She worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent brass and chambering a fresh round, then settled back behind the scope to observe. At 1,000 yards, the bullet took nearly 2 full seconds to reach the target, traveling at supersonic velocity for most of its journey, but decelerating constantly due to air resistance. During those 2 seconds, Vivian was aware of absolute silence behind her. No commentary, no jokes, just the sound of wind and the distant flutter of range flags. The target frame shuddered slightly, the impact visible even at this distance. Pritchett had his binoculars up instantly, and Vivian watched his posture change as he studied the hit. His shoulders straightened fractionally. His grip on the binoculars tightened. When he finally lowered them and turned toward the group, his expression was carefully neutral in a way that communicated more than words. Center mass, he said flatly. Maybe 6 inches left of center. Solid hit. The murmur that rippled through the gathered soldiers was different now. Not dismissive, not mocking. Something closer to confusion, as if observable reality had just contradicted fundamental assumptions about how the universe operated. Vivian heard Braxton demand the binoculars, heard him verify the hit himself with a long silence that felt heavier than any words could have been. Braxton lowered the binoculars slowly, his face working through expressions like someone testing different masks to find one that fit. He settled on skeptical dismissal, though it sat less comfortably on his features than it had 30 minutes earlier. Wind shifted right when she fired, he announced to no one in particular. Caught a favorable gust. Anyone can get lucky once. Lieutenant Vance had moved closer to the shooting bench, her interest no longer concealed behind professional neutrality. That was a solid shot, Staff Sergeant, she said quietly. At 1,000 yards with a weapon she just picked up, that is more than luck. Braxton's jaw tightened, and Vivian could see him recalculating his approach. He turned to face her directly, his posture aggressive despite the evidence literally downrange. All right, Corporal, he said, his voice tight. One shot proves nothing. Real marksmen can replicate their results. How about you put another round downrange, and we see if that was skill or coincidence? Vivian had already chambered a fresh round. She did not need to respond verbally. Instead, she settled back behind the scope and began her breathing routine again. The wind had shifted slightly, now coming more directly from the west with less variation in velocity. The temperature had climbed another degree according to the thermal shimmer patterns. She made a fractional adjustment to her windage, half a click left to account for the change conditions. The second shot came perhaps 40 seconds after the first. The Barrett roared again, and again the rifle's recoil was substantial but manageable. Vivian rode it smoothly and immediately worked the bolt, her movements efficient and practiced. She stayed behind the scope this time, watching through the magnification as the bullet completed its 2-second journey and struck the target frame with visible impact. Upper chest, she said aloud before Pritchett could raise his binoculars. 4 inches right of center, maybe 2 inches high. Pritchett verified with the binoculars and nodded slowly. That is correct, he confirmed, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before. Something approaching respect. 2 for 2 at 1,000 yards. Grouping is maybe 10 inches between them. 10 inches at 1,000 yards translated to approximately 1 minute of angle, which was exceptional accuracy for any shooter under field conditions with an unfamiliar weapon. Vivian knew this. Everyone on the range with any real shooting experience knew this. The Barrett was capable of better precision than that, but only in the hands of expert marksmen using carefully selected ammunition under controlled conditions. Private Nguyen let out a low whistle that cut through the silence. "Man," he said, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "That is some serious shooting." Braxton spun to face him, his expression thunderous. "Get back to your own qualification, Private. This does not concern you." Nguyen retreated, but his expression suggested he disagreed with that assessment. Around them, the crowd had grown larger. Word had apparently spread beyond the immediate firing line, and soldiers from other parts of the range complex were drifting over to see what was happening. Vivian could feel the weight of their attention, the shift in atmosphere from entertainment at expected failure to genuine curiosity about unexpected competence. Lieutenant Vance stepped forward, her voice carrying authority that cut through the murmurs. "Staff Sergeant Braxton, I think Corporal Reese has demonstrated her proficiency with the weapon system. Perhaps we should move on with regular qualification schedules." But Braxton was not finished. His pride had been challenged in a way that apparently required resolution beyond what 2 excellent shots could provide. "Ma'am, with respect," he said, his tone suggesting the words carried no actual respect at all. 2 shots at a static target in relatively mild conditions is basic proficiency. What separates true expert marksmen from competent shooters is the ability to engage challenging targets at extreme distances. We have a steel plates set up at 1,800 meters for the advanced course. Maybe Corporal Reese would like to demonstrate her skills at a distance where environmental factors actually dominate the equation. 1,800 meters, just over a mile, nearly double the distance she had just successfully engaged. At that range, the bullet would drop over 200 feet from the line of sight. Flight time would exceed 3 seconds. Wind drift would be measured in yards rather than inches. The target would be barely visible even through high magnification optics. It was a distance where professional snipers with weeks of training on specific weapon systems sometimes struggled to achieve consistent hits. Vivian looked at the massive rifle on the bench before her. The Barrett was capable of reaching 1,800 meters. The ballistics supported it. The platform was designed for it. But capable and practical were different concepts. At that distance, every variable multiplied into a complex equation where small errors cascaded into large misses. Her father had engaged targets at similar distances, but always with extensive preparation, multiple ranging shots, detailed environmental data, and purpose-built ammunition. "Staff Sergeant," Lieutenant Vance said, her voice hardening, "that is an unreasonable request. 1,800 meters requires specialized training and preparation. This has moved beyond qualification into something else entirely." Braxton smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "I'm just trying to establish realistic expectations, ma'am. Corporal Reese here has shown she can shoot. I'm not disputing that anymore. But there is a difference between being a decent shot and being someone who should be taken seriously as a precision marksman. If she can touch steel at 1,800 meters, even once, then I will personally recommend her for advanced marksmanship training. But if she cannot, then maybe we can all agree that what we saw here today was good basic skills, nothing more." The challenge hung in the air like a physical object, heavy and unavoidable. Vivian felt the eyes of every soldier on the range fixed on her, waiting for her response. She could decline. Lieutenant Vance had essentially given her permission to walk away. No one would fault her for refusing a shot that even experienced snipers would consider ambitious under ideal conditions, let alone with an unfamiliar rifle and minimal preparation. But declining meant leaving a question unanswered. It meant walking away while Braxton maintained his narrative about luck and favorable conditions. It meant every future range session would carry the weight of that moment when she chose not to try. She thought about her father, Master Sergeant Dalton Reese, who had spent 26 years in the Army before cancer took him 3 years ago. She thought about the lessons he had taught her, not just about shooting, but about when to prove yourself and when to let results speak louder than words. He would have recognized what was happening here. He would have understood that some challenges were less about the actual task and more about establishing where you stood. "I will take the shot," Vivian said quietly. The murmur that rippled through the crowd was audible, a mixture of surprise and anticipation. Even Lieutenant Vance looked uncertain, though she did not countermand the decision. Instead, she moved closer to Vivian and lowered her voice to a level meant only for her. "You do not need to do this," she repeated. "Braxton is trying to set you up for failure. 1,800 meters is a professional sniper shot. No one expects you to make it." "I know, ma'am," Vivian replied, "but I would like to try anyway." Vance studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but we do this correctly. Full environmental data. Proper ranging. Take your time. There is no rush." The walk to the 1,800-meter firing position felt different than the previous movements across the range. The crowd followed, but their energy had changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by something closer to genuine curiosity. They were watching someone attempt something difficult, and the outcome was no longer certain. Even the soldiers who had been loudest in their dismissal earlier were quiet now, their expressions showing the same fascination that came from watching any high-stakes performance. Pritchett set up a range finder and called out the exact distance. 1,812 meters to target, he announced. Wind is west-northwest at 14 miles per hour, gusting to 19. Temperature, 106 degrees. Barometric pressure, 29.84 inches. Vivian processed the information, running calculations that her father had drilled into her until they became automatic. The bullet drop at this distance would be catastrophic without proper compensation. She would need to aim approximately 15 feet above the target to account for gravity's effect over the 3+ second flight time. The wind would push the round at least 6 yards off course without correction. The heat and altitude would affect air density and therefore drag coefficients. She settled behind the Barrett and adjusted the scope to maximum magnification. Through the optics, the steel plate at 1,800 meters was barely visible, a small rectangular shape wavering in layers of heat mirage like something glimpsed through troubled water. The plate was approximately 2 feet by 3 feet, which sounds substantial until you considered it was more than a mile away. At this distance, it subtended less than half a minute of angle in her sight picture. The wind was her greatest enemy. At 14 miles per hour with gusts to 19, the variability meant she needed to time her shot for a lull or risk the gust pushing her round completely off target. She watched the mirage patterns, studying the way the heat waves moved across her view. The wind at the firing line was not the same as the wind at the target, and both were different from the wind at the midpoint of the bullet's trajectory. She needed to read all three and synthesize them into a single compensation value. Behind her, Braxton was speaking quietly to one of the other sergeants, but his voice carried in the desert stillness. Even if she hits the plate, it is mostly luck at this distance. Too many variables. Professional snipers take days to prepare for shots like this. She is working with maybe 5 minutes of observation. Vivian tuned him out. She had learned long ago that other people's opinions were background noise, meaningless unless you chose to give them meaning. What mattered was the rifle in her hands, the target downrange, and the physics that connected them. Everything else was distraction. She made her elevation adjustment, cranking the scope turret up until the reticle sat impossibly high above the target. Then she dialed in her windage, calculating for an average wind speed of 16 miles per hour based on what she observed. It was an educated guess more than a precise measurement, but precision was impossible under these conditions. The best she could do was get close and trust her read of the environment. Her breathing settled into its rhythm. For count in, 2 count hold, 6 count out, natural pause. The rifle rose and fell with each breath, and she waited for everything to align. The wind needed to settle. Her heartbeat needed to slow. The mirage needed to show her a consistent pattern. All of these things needed to happen simultaneously, and she needed to recognize the moment when they did. Private Nguyen had positioned himself where he could see both Vivian and the distant target through his spotting scope. His role was unofficial, self-appointed, but his presence felt steadying somehow. She could sense his focus, his genuine hope that she would succeed, and it created a small pocket of positive energy in an atmosphere otherwise thick with skepticism. The wind lulled. The mirage steadied. Her heart found the space between beats. Vivian pressed the trigger. The Barrett's report echoed across the range like thunder rolling through a canyon. The muzzle blast kicking up a cloud of dust that momentarily obscured everything. The recoil drove back into Vivian's shoulder with familiar force, and she rode it smoothly before settling back behind the scope. At this distance, the bullet's flight time stretched into an eternity of waiting, 3 full seconds where physics and chance would determine the outcome of all her calculations. She stayed on the scope, watching the distant steel plate through the magnification and the shimmering heat waves. Beside her, Private Nguyen was glued to his spotting scope, his breathing suspended as he tracked the target. Behind them, the gathered soldiers had fallen into complete silence. Even Braxton had stopped talking, his arms crossed over his chest as he waited for the outcome that would prove his point. The seconds ticked past with agonizing slowness. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Vivian saw nothing at first, just the wavering image of the distant steel and the desert beyond it. Then, just as doubt began creeping into her mind, the plate moved. It was subtle, barely visible at this distance, but unmistakable. The steel target rocked backward on its mount from an impact, then settled back into position. Nguyen exploded out of his position behind the spotting scope. "Hit!" he shouted, his voice cracking with excitement. She hit the plate. Dead center, I saw the impact. The reaction from the crowd was immediate and chaotic. Some soldiers rushed forward to verify through binoculars and spotting scopes. Others simply stood in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. A few shook their heads as if clearing water from their ears, as though the problem was with their hearing rather than their assumptions. The noise level rose from reverent silence to excited conversation in the span of seconds. Pritchett had his binoculars up, scanning the distant target with intense focus. He studied it for long seconds, then handed the binoculars to Lieutenant Vance without comment. Vance looked through them, her expression neutral, but her posture communicating surprise. She lowered the binoculars and turned to look at Vivian with open curiosity, as if seeing her for the first time. That was an 1,800-meter shot, Vance said slowly, each word carefully measured. With a rifle you had never fired before today. Using environmental data, you gathered yourself in less than 10 minutes. That is not beginner's luck, Corporal. That is expert-level marksmanship. Braxton moved forward and practically ripped the binoculars from Vance's hands. He pressed them to his eyes with enough force that it must have been uncomfortable, scanning the distant target, as if looking for evidence of some trick or mistake. Vivian watched his face as he processed what he was seeing, watched the muscles in his jaw work as he ground his teeth, watched the color rise in his neck and cheeks. The wind shifted right as she fired, he said finally, his voice tight. Compensated for the gust without meaning to. Environmental luck. Happens at extreme distances, sometimes, but his words lacked conviction now, and everyone within earshot could hear it. The explanation was too convenient, too desperate, too obviously an attempt to preserve a narrative that observable reality had just contradicted. Some of the gathered soldiers exchanged glances that communicated their skepticism about Braxton's assessment more clearly than words could have. Corporal Reese, Lieutenant Vance said, her voice cutting through the noise. Where exactly did you learn to shoot like this? Vivian safed the Barrett and stood up from behind the rifle, feeling the stiffness in her legs from the sustained prone position. My father taught me, ma'am. Master Sergeant Dalton Reese. He was a sniper instructor at Fort Benning for 12 years. Started teaching me when I was 8 years old. The information landed like another impact downrange. Vance's expression shifted as pieces clicked into place, and Vivian could see her mentally revising everything she thought she knew about the situation. Around them, soldiers who had been so certain about Vivian's incompetence minutes earlier were now reassessing with the uncomfortable energy of people realizing they had badly misjudged something important. Master Sergeant Dalton Reese, Vance repeated slowly. I knew that name. He ran the Advanced Precision Rifle course, produced some of the best snipers in the Army. Your father was legendary in the marksmanship community. Yes, ma'am, Vivian said quietly. He passed away 3 years ago. The silence that followed felt different than the earlier quiet. This was respectful, acknowledging the kind of silence that followed when someone mentioned fallen soldiers or lost mentors. Even Braxton seemed momentarily subdued, though his expression remained stormy. Why did you not say something earlier? Vance asked, and there was genuine confusion in her voice. When Staff Sergeant Braxton was questioning your abilities, you could have mentioned your background. Could have saved everyone a lot of time and posturing. Vivian met her gaze steadily. I have learned that it is better to let results speak for themselves, ma'am. People believe what they see, not what they are told. The answer hung in the air, and Vivian saw several soldiers nod unconsciously in agreement. It was a truth that anyone who had been consistently underestimated understood intimately. Words were cheap and easily dismissed. Results were irrefutable, and the targets downrange told a story that required no additional explanation. Lieutenant Vance studied Vivian with an expression that suggested she was recalculating everything about the day's events. Staff Sergeant Braxton, she said without taking her eyes off Vivian, I think we can agree that Corporal Reese has demonstrated more than adequate proficiency with precision rifle systems. Perhaps you would like to revise your earlier assessment about basic skills and favorable conditions. Braxton's face had gone through several shades of red, finally settling on something close to purple. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words that would not make the situation worse. Around him, the other soldiers had begun talking among themselves in low voices, their conversations animated with the energy of people who had just witnessed something unexpected and were trying to process it. Private Nguyen approached Vivian with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he had forgotten about rank structure entirely. That was incredible, Corporal, he said, his words tumbling over each other. I mean, I have been shooting my whole life, grew up hunting in Montana, and I have never seen anyone make a shot like that. 1,800 meters with basically no prep time. That is the kind of thing you see in movies, not on an actual range. Vivian felt uncomfortable with the praise, with the attention, with the sudden shift from being dismissed to being celebrated. She had not come to the range seeking recognition. She had simply wanted to complete her qualification requirements and move on with her day. But Braxton's challenges had escalated the situation beyond anything she had anticipated, and now she was standing in the center of a crowd that wanted explanations and demonstrations and validation of what they had witnessed. How many times have you shot at that distance? One of the rangers asked, his tone genuinely curious rather than challenging. Because that is not something most people can do cold, even with experience. My father had me engaging targets past 1,500 meters by the time I was 16, Vivian replied. We would spend weekends at civilian ranges, working on technique and environmental reading. He believed that understanding long-range shooting was less about the weapon and more about reading conditions accurately. The ranger nodded slowly, processing this information. Dalton Reese was your father, he said, and it was not really a question. I went through his course at Benning in 2019. Best instructor I ever had. He could read wind like some people read books. Made impossible shots look routine. He was exceptional, Vivian agreed, quietly, feeling the familiar weight of loss that came with talking about her father. He made me practice until environmental reading was instinctive. Said that at extreme distances, the shooter who understands conditions will beat the shooter with better equipment every time. Lieutenant Vance had been listening to this exchange with focused attention. "Corporal Reese," she said, her tone shifting into something more official. "I'm going to need you to come to my office after we secure the range. We need to discuss your actual qualifications and why a soldier with your background is currently classified as a logistics specialist rather than working in a capacity that utilizes these skills." Vivian felt a knot form in her stomach. This was the conversation she had been avoiding for 3 years, the one about why she had chosen to support MOS rather than following her father into the precision shooting community. The reasons were complicated and personal, tied up with grief and the need to forge her own path separate from her father's shadow. But explaining that to a superior officer who saw wasted talent and inefficient personnel allocation would be difficult. "Yes, ma'am," she said, because there was no other acceptable response. Braxton had recovered some of his composure, though his expression remained stormy. "Ma'am," he said to Vance, his voice strained but controlled. "With respect, one good day on the range does not necessarily indicate sustained capability. Perhaps Corporal Reese would be willing to demonstrate her skills again under more controlled conditions. We could set up a proper evaluation, multiple shots at various distances, documented results." The suggestion was reasonable on its surface, but Vivian could hear the subtext. Braxton wanted another chance to find some flaw, some limit, some evidence that what had happened today was not representative of her actual ability. He needed to restore some equilibrium to a situation that had spun completely out of his control. Vance considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. "That is not an unreasonable request," she said. "Corporal Reese, would you be willing to participate in a formal marksmanship evaluation? No pressure if you would prefer not to. You have already exceeded any reasonable expectation for today." Vivian thought about declining. She could walk away now with her point made, her competence established, her father's legacy honored. But she also understood that Braxton would use any refusal as evidence that today had been anomaly rather than ability. The doubt would persist, and she would face the same skepticism at the next range session and the one after that. "I will participate, ma'am," she said. "Whatever evaluation you think is appropriate." The decision seemed to settle something in the atmosphere. Vance looked satisfied. Braxton looked determined in a way that suggested he viewed this as a second chance rather than a continuation of defeat. The gathered soldiers looked eager for more entertainment, more demonstration, more evidence of the extraordinary thing they had just witnessed. Gwyn was grinning like someone who had just discovered his favorite team had a secret superstar. "This is going to be legendary," he said to no one in particular. "Wait until the rest of the battalion hears about this. Nobody is going to believe it without seeing it themselves." And that, Vivian realized, was both the promise and the problem. She had stepped out of comfortable anonymity and into visibility. She had proven her abilities in a way that could not be ignored or dismissed. But visibility came with expectations and attention and pressure that she had spent 3 years carefully avoiding. Her father used to say that being the best at something was less about the skill itself and more about being willing to accept what came with recognition. She was beginning to understand what he meant. The formal evaluation was scheduled for 3 days later, and word spread through Fort Kearny with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. By the time Vivian arrived at the range that morning, there were at least 50 soldiers gathered as spectators, far more than had witnessed her initial demonstrations. Some had driven from other parts of the base. A few had apparently taken leave time specifically to watch. The atmosphere felt less like a qualification event and more like a sporting competition, complete with informal betting pools and spirited debate about expected outcomes. Lieutenant Vance had assembled a proper evaluation committee. Besides herself, there was Master Sergeant Raymond Cho from the Sniper School at Benning, Captain Felix Hartwell from the Base Marksmanship Unit, and Chief Warrant Officer 3 Leonor Vasquez, who had a reputation as one of the finest shots in the entire Western Command. These were not casual observers. These were experts who would recognize both excellence and deception, and their presence transformed the event from personal challenge into professional assessment. Braxton stood near the equipment tables, his expression carefully neutral, but his posture radiating tension. He had spent the past 3 days, Vivian had heard through the informal network, researching her father's teaching methods and preparing arguments about how childhood training did not necessarily translate to adult performance under pressure. He was looking for any angle, any leverage, any way to contextualize what was about to happen in terms that would minimize her achievement. The evaluation protocol was comprehensive. 10 shots at 500 meters, 10 shots at 1,000 meters, 5 shots at 1,500 meters, 3 shots at 2,000 meters. Multiple weapon systems including the M4, the M110, and the Barrett M82. Environmental conditions would be documented. Each shot would be recorded and analyzed. This was not about getting lucky with favorable wind. This was about demonstrating consistent, replicable precision across a range of scenarios and distances. Corporal Reese, Master Sergeant Cho, said as she approached the first firing position, "I knew your father. Served with him at Benning for 6 years. He was one of the best instructors the Army ever produced and a better man than most. I am not here to judge you against his legacy. I am here to assess your capabilities on their own merit. Understood?" "Understood, Master Sergeant," Vivian replied. Cho nodded and gestured toward the rifle. "Whenever you are ready. Take your time. There is no clock on this evaluation." The 500-meter shots were almost routine. Vivian settled behind the M110 semi-automatic sniper rifle and put all 10 rounds into a grouping that measured less than 4 inches. The assembled experts conferred quietly among themselves, making notes on clipboards, nodding at observations that Vivian could not hear. When Pritchett called out the grouping measurement, a murmur ran through the spectator crowd. At 1,000 meters with the Barrett, the challenge increased substantially. The wind had picked up since the morning, now gusting unpredictably between 12 and 20 miles per hour. The heat mirage was severe, creating layers of distortion that made accurate range estimation difficult. Vivian took her time with each shot, reading the conditions, waiting for the wind to settle into patterns she could predict. 9 of her 10 shots hit the target center mass. The 10th caught the edge of the plate, still a hit, but not centered like the others. Chief Warrant Officer Vasquez studied the results through a high-powered spotting scope, then turned to confer with the other evaluators. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Vivian thought she detected a slight nod of approval. When she finished her discussion with the other experts, Vasquez approached Vivian directly. "That wind is nasty today," she said conversationally, gusting patterns with no consistency. "Most shooters would be lucky to keep 50% on target at that distance in these conditions. You put 90% center mass and caught the plate on what I assume was a wind shift on the 10th round." "Yes, ma'am," Vivian confirmed. "Gust hit right as I broke the trigger. Could not compensate in time." Vasquez smiled slightly. "The fact that you recognized it tells me you are reading conditions correctly. Let us see how you do at 1,500 meters." The 1,500-meter targets were where many shooters began to struggle consistently. At that distance, the cumulative effect of small errors became impossible to ignore. A tiny mistake in reading wind speed, a fractional miscalculation of elevation, even a shooter's pulse at the moment of trigger break could push a shot off target. Vivian had 5 attempts to demonstrate capability at this range, and she knew that the evaluators would be watching not just for hits, but for consistency. She took nearly 10 minutes preparing for the first shot, studying wind indicators at multiple points along the bullet's path, checking and rechecking her elevation calculations, waiting for her breathing and heart rate to settle into optimal rhythm. When she finally pressed the trigger, the Barrett roared and the massive round began its 3-second journey downrange. Through the scope, she watched the steel plate rock backward from the impact, the hit clearly visible even at this extreme distance. 4 more shots followed over the next 30 minutes. She took her time with each one, refusing to rush despite the pressure of watching eyes and evaluating experts. 3 hit center mass. 1 caught the upper edge of the plate. The fifth missed entirely, sailing past the target as a gust of wind caught it at the worst possible moment. 4 out of 5 at 1,500 meters, Captain Hartwell announced after confirming the results. That is exceptional performance, Corporal. Most designated marksmen would be satisfied with 3 out of 5 under these conditions. The 2,000-meter challenge represented the absolute limit of what the Barrett M82 could reasonably accomplish under field conditions. At that distance, the bullet would drop nearly 300 feet from line of sight and take over 4 seconds to reach the target. Wind drift would be measured in multiple yards. The Coriolis effect from Earth's rotation would become a meaningful factor. Temperature, humidity, altitude, even the angle of the sun affecting mirage patterns all combined into an equation so complex that professional snipers sometimes spend hours preparing for a single shot at comparable distances. Vivian had 3 attempts, 3 chances to demonstrate that she could engage targets at ranges where most soldiers would not even bother trying. The steel plate downrange was barely visible even through maximum magnification, a tiny rectangular shape that wavered and distorted in the layered heat shimmer like something from a dream. Master Sergeant Cho positioned himself beside her with a laser rangefinder and a handheld weather station. 2,047 meters, he announced. Wind 15 miles per hour from the west with gusts to 23. Temperature 108 degrees. Relative humidity 18%. Barometric pressure 29.76 inches. Altitude 4,200 feet above sea level. The data was more precise than what she had worked with during her initial demonstration, but it also highlighted just how many variables were in play. Vivian input the information into her mental calculations, drawing on years of experience and her father's teachings about how environmental factors interacted at extreme distances. The elevation adjustment alone would require her to aim so far above the target that the steel plate would not even be visible in her scope at the moment of firing. She settled behind the Barrett and began her preparation routine. The rifle felt familiar now after the previous firing strings, its weight and balance no longer foreign. She adjusted the bipod legs to account for the slight slope of the firing position, verified her body alignment, confirmed that her grip and shoulder placement would manage the substantial recoil without disruption. Through the scope, she studied the distant target and the terrain between her position and the steel plate. She could see flags at various distances along the range, each one telling her something about wind conditions at that specific point. The wind was not consistent. It was stronger near the target than at her position, with a complex pattern in the middle distance where terrain features created eddies and shifts. Reading this accurately was less science than art, a synthesis of observation and intuition that took years to develop. She made her elevation adjustment, cranking the turret up until the reticle sat impossibly high. Then she dialed in windage, compensating for what she estimated as an average 18-mile-per-hour crosswind across the bullet's flight path. It was an educated guess based on incomplete information, but that was the nature of extreme distance shooting. Perfect data was impossible. You made the best assessment you could and trusted your read of the environment. Her breathing settled into rhythm. The world narrowed to the scope picture, the rifle, and the distant steel plate that represented success or failure. She was aware of the crowd behind her, the evaluating experts, Braxton watching with barely concealed hope that she would miss. But all of that was background noise, meaningless unless she chose to give it meaning. The wind lulled. The mirage pattern steadied. Her heart found the space between beats. She pressed the trigger, and the Barrett thundered, its massive report echoing across the desert like a physical force. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, and she rode it smoothly, immediately working the bolt and settling back behind the scope to observe. For seconds of waiting, for seconds where the bullet arced through the air at supersonic velocity, shedding energy to drag, dropping continuously from gravity, pushed sideways by wind that varied along every meter of its flight path. For seconds where dozens of variables determined whether her calculations had been accurate. The steel plate moved. It was barely visible at this distance, but the impact was unmistakable. The target rocked backward on its mount, confirmed hit, and the crowd behind her erupted. Private Nguyen was shouting something incoherent. Several soldiers were cheering. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Even some of the evaluating experts looked surprised, though they maintained professional composure better than the spectators. Confirmed hit, Pritchett called out through binoculars. Upper right quadrant, maybe 18 inches from center. At 2,000 meters plus. That is an extraordinary shot, Corporal. Chief Warrant Officer Vasquez moved forward, her expression showing open admiration now. I have been shooting competitively and professionally for 22 years, she said quietly enough that only Vivian and the immediate evaluators could hear. I have trained some of the best snipers in the military. What you just did is Olympic-level precision shooting. That is not beginner talent. That is not even advanced talent. That is world-class capability. Vivian felt overwhelmed by the praise, by the attention, by the reality of what she had demonstrated. She had tried to stay invisible, tried to avoid her father's shadow, tried to forge her own path separate from the expectations that came with being Dalton Reese's daughter. But the Barrett and the distant targets had made invisibility impossible. You have 2 more attempts, Master Sergeant Cho reminded her. The evaluation protocol requires 3 shots at this distance. Do you need time to prepare for the second shot, or are you ready to continue? Vivian considered. Her first shot had hit, but not centered. She could analyze what went wrong, adjust her wind call, try to improve the result. Or she could accept that one hit at 2,000 meters was already extraordinary and risk missing the next 2 attempts. I will take the second shot, she said. The second shot required a different approach. Vivian had hit high and right on the first attempt, which suggested her wind call had been slightly conservative and her elevation fractionally overcompensated. She made minute adjustments to both, dialing back a quarter minute of angle on elevation and adding half a minute on windage. The corrections were tiny, almost imperceptible, but at 2,000 meters, even the smallest change could mean the difference between center mass and complete miss. She settled back into position and began her breathing routine again. The crowd had quieted, everyone understanding they were witnessing something rare and wanting to see how it would unfold. Even Braxton had stopped fidgeting, his attention fixed on the distant target with an intensity that suggested he had moved beyond personal pride into genuine curiosity about what was possible. The wind conditions had shifted slightly. The gusts were less frequent now, but when they came, they were stronger, hitting 25 miles per hour before dying back to calm. This inconsistency made timing critical. She needed to fire during a lull, not during a gust, and predicting when those lulls would occur required reading subtle indicators that most people would never notice. She waited. 30 seconds passed, then a minute. The crowd grew restless behind her, but she ignored them, focused entirely on the flags and mirage patterns and the feel of air movement against her face. Finally, she saw what she was looking for. The wind settled into a brief period of consistency, steady at 16 miles per hour from the west with minimal variation. This was her window. The Barrett roared its familiar thunder. For seconds of flight time. For seconds of calculated trajectory through turbulent air. For seconds where physics and probability determine the outcome. The steel plate rocked backward. Harder this time, the impact clearly visible even without magnification. Through the scope, Vivian saw where the round had struck. Center mass. Perhaps 6 inches from the geometric center of the target. At 2,047 meters, the crowd's reaction was even louder than before. Soldiers were shouting, some were embracing. Private Nguyen appeared to be jumping up and down. The noise was overwhelming, a wall of sound that Vivian had not anticipated and did not quite know how to process. Center mass, Pritchett confirmed, his voice carrying wonder despite his attempt at professional neutrality. That is a textbook precision shot at over 2,000 meters. 2 for 2 at that distance. This is remarkable shooting. Chief Warrant Officer Vasquez was conferring with the other evaluators, their discussion animated despite their efforts to maintain composure. Captain Hartwell was shaking his head slowly, not in disagreement, but in the universal gesture of someone witnessing something that exceeded expectations. Master Sergeant Cho was smiling, and there was something in his expression that suggested pride, as if Vivian's performance somehow honored the memory of her father who had been his friend and colleague. "One more shot," Cho said, approaching Vivian. "You're already 2 for 2, which is better than most professional snipers could achieve under these conditions. The third shot is yours to take or decline. Either way, you have already exceeded the evaluation requirements." Vivian considered the option to stop. She had proven her point thoroughly. 2 hits at over 2,000 meters was extraordinary by any measure. But something in her wanted to complete the protocol, to finish what she had started, to honor the process rather than stopping early even when permitted. "I will take the third shot," she said. This time, she did not overthink the preparation. She trusted her previous adjustments, trusted her read of the wind, trusted the muscle memory and instinct that her father had spent years developing. She settled behind the rifle, found her breathing rhythm quickly, waited for the wind to stabilize, and pressed the trigger almost before conscious thought caught up with action. The Barrett's report. The 4-second wait. The steel plate rocking backward from impact. 3 for 3. The crowd's response was deafening now, a roar of approval and disbelief that rolled across the range like a physical wave. Soldiers who had never met Vivian before were cheering as if she had just won a championship for their team. Even some of the evaluators were applauding, their professional detachment finally giving way to genuine admiration. Pritchett confirmed the hit location, center mass again, perhaps 8 inches from perfect center. Vasquez walked over to Vivian and extended her hand formally, the gesture carrying weight and meaning that transcended simple congratulation. "Corporal Reese," she said, her voice pitched to carry to the evaluators and nearby soldiers. "I am recommending you for immediate transfer to the Advanced Marksmanship Program. What you demonstrated today is not just competence. It is mastery. The Army needs shooters of your caliber in roles where that skill can be properly utilized." Vivian shook her hand, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her circumstances. 3 days ago, she had been invisible, anonymous, another logistics specialist completing routine qualifications. Now she was standing in front of 50 witnesses and a committee of expert evaluators who had just seen her achieve something that most soldiers could not do with months of preparation. If you enjoyed the story, please drop a comment and let us know your favorite part, or if you have ever witnessed someone prove the doubters wrong in a similar way. Maybe you know someone who kept their skills quiet until the perfect moment to reveal them. Lieutenant Vance stepped forward, her expression showing satisfaction and something that might have been vindication. "Staff Sergeant Braxton," she said, her tone professionally neutral but carrying an edge that everyone present could hear. "Do you have any further concerns about Corporal Reese's capabilities, or can we consider your earlier assessment revised?" Braxton's face had gone through several colors during the demonstration, finally settling on a shade that suggested internal struggle between pride and reality. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "No further concerns. That was exceptional shooting. I was wrong about her capabilities." The admission seemed to cost him something, but it also diffused the tension that had been building throughout the evaluation. Vivian felt no satisfaction in his acknowledgement. She had not done this to humiliate anyone or prove superiority. She had simply wanted to shoot without constantly defending her presence on the range. Master Sergeant Cho approached her as the crowd began to disperse, soldiers returning to their duties with stories they would tell for years. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly, "not just of the shooting, though that was remarkable, but of how you handled yourself throughout this entire situation. Dignity and composure under pressure. That is what separates good soldiers from great ones." "Thank you, Master Sergeant," Vivian replied, feeling emotion tighten her throat. That means a great deal coming from someone who knew him. The range was clearing now, the extraordinary moment giving way to ordinary routine. But something had changed fundamentally. Vivian was no longer invisible. She was no longer just another logistics specialist going through qualification motions. She had stepped into visibility, into recognition, into a role that her father had prepared her for even as she had tried to avoid it. As she secured the Barrett and prepared to leave the firing line. She looked out at the distant steel plates that had become the canvas for her demonstration. 2,000 meters. An impossible distance made possible through preparation and skill and the teachings of a father who had believed his daughter could achieve anything if she was willing to work for it. She had proven the doubters wrong. But more importantly, she had proven to herself that stepping out of the shadows was not betraying her father's memory. It was honoring